In this video, we are going to be having a basic introduction to inequalities and their graphs, and we're going to be using interval notation. An inequality is a mathematical sentence that uses an inequality symbol, like the symbols in the parentheses here, to compare the values of two expressions. In the chart, I have them listed here, so we have less than, greater than, less than or equal to, greater than or equal to. So let's look at some examples, some comparisons. So we have 2 is less than 5. 5 is greater than 2. X is less than or equal to 3. 3 is greater than or equal to X. So that's how you would read these mathematical sentences using the inequality symbols. So let's graph some inequalities. So in my chart, we have less than and we have greater than. When we graph those inequalities, we're going to be using parentheses. And then we have less than or equal to, greater than or equal to. And when we graph those, we're going to be using brackets. If you look at the difference between the inequalities, when we have the or equal to inequality, we have a little line underneath the inequality. And so when we have that line, we're going to be utilizing brackets when we graph them. So let's look at our first example. We have x is less than 3. 3 is not going to be a solution to this inequality. If we look at our chart above, with the less than, we will be graphing using a parentheses. So what this means is that x is less than 3, so we'll have a parentheses at 3. Since x is less than 3, it's going to be going to the left of 3. It's going to be smaller than 3. Let's look at the next example. We have x is greater than negative 1. Again, that greater than inequality falls underneath that parentheses. It does not have a line underneath the inequality, so therefore negative 1 is not a solution to this inequality, so we're going to be using a parentheses when we graph. X is greater than, so that means it's greater than, bigger than negative 1. So we are going to put a parentheses at negative 1, and then we're going to be drawing our line to the right of negative 1 since x is greater than negative 1. All right, let's look at another example. We have x is less than or equal to 2. Here we have a line underneath that inequality. And so that means when we graph, we're going to be using a bracket. And also what this means is that 2 is a solution to this inequality. So that's what triggers that we're going to be using a bracket. Since x is less than, that means it's going to be smaller than 2. It's going to go towards the negative numbers. So we're going to put a bracket at 2, and then we're going to be drawing our line to the left of 2. And then the next example, we have x is greater than or equal to negative 4. Again, we have a line underneath that inequality, so that means that negative 4 is a solution to this inequality. So we're going to be using a bracket when we graph at negative 4. X is greater than, so it's bigger than negative 4, so it's going to be going to the right of that bracket when we draw our line. So we'll have a bracket at negative 4 and then a line going towards the positive direction to the right. So we're always going to want to try to rewrite the inequalities where the variable is on the left. It becomes much easier to graph. I think it's really hard in my brain to understand what's really happening when that variable is on the right. So anytime I have it on the right, I want to rewrite it to the left. And so I like to look at the inequalities as an alligator. And so the alligator always eats the larger number. So in this case, the alligator is eating the A, so A is the larger number. So if we're going to rewrite it where A is first or on the left, we're going to have A is greater than or equal to 2. And so this is much easier for me to see what's happening now when I'm going to graph it. And these are actually identical inequalities. They're just written in different ways. And notice that the alligator is still eating the A, like at the inequality above it. And so now I'm ready to graph it. And so when I graph it, since there is a line underneath that inequality, there's going to be a bracket at 2, and then A is greater than, so it's bigger than, so it's going to be going to the right of 2. So let's write some inequalities given the graph. I'm also going to be showing you how to write it in interval notation as well. And so let's look at the first line here. We have at the orange line, we have a parentheses at 0. So what that means is that 0 is not going to be a solution to that inequality. Our line is going to the right, so it's going to the positive direction. And so I'm going to say that x is greater than 0 here. And so I'm going to write that as an inequality. It would be x is greater than 0, so no line underneath that inequality. Once I want to write that as an interval notation, to me, it's much easier to write it in interval notation at this point when I see the graph. I'm going to start at 0 and I'm going to put a parentheses at 0, and then it's going to be comma infinity since I'm going to the right, and then I'm going to have a close parentheses after that infinity symbol. Always, when you have the infinity, whether it's going to be negative infinity or positive infinity, you always will have a parentheses next to the infinity symbol. Let's look at the green line. So the difference between the green and the orange here is that the green line is still going to the right, it's going to the positive direction, but this time we have a bracket at -2, which means that -2 is a solution to that inequality. And so here I'm going to choose the variable z, so z is greater than or equal to -2. And so z is going to have that inequality is going to have that line underneath it, so z is greater than or equal to -2. That's how you would write it as an algebraic expression using the inequality. Now, when we want to write it as an interval notation, we're going to start at that -2 and have a bracket next to that -2, but then it goes to positive infinity again, and so then we'll have parentheses after that infinity symbol. All right, let's look at the yellow line. We have a bracket at -3, and so that means that -3 is going to be a solution to this inequality. This time our line's going to the left of -3, so it's smaller than. And so I'm going to use p this time as my variable, so p is less than or equal to -3, since there's a bracket that tells me that it is equal to -3 or can be equal to -3. And so as an inequality, we would write it as p is less than or equal with a line underneath it to -3. Now, to write this in interval notation, since p is less than, we're actually going to be starting with negative infinity, and there will be parentheses and then negative infinity, and there'll be comma -3 with a bracket. All right, let's look at our last example here. We have a parentheses at 4, and our line is going to the left. It's going to the negative numbers, so it's going to that negative infinity again. And so this time I'm going to, and 4 would not be a solution to this inequality because of that parentheses. And so this time I'm going to be using the variable w. So we would say that w is less than 4. So when we write that as an inequality, we would write that as w is less than 4 with no line underneath that inequality. The alligator would definitely be eating the 4 since it's the bigger number. And then if we want to write that in interval notation, since it's going towards negative infinity, we would have negative infinity first, so parentheses negative infinity, comma, up to 4, and then we have a parentheses where that 4 is located.